Hello, I'm Joseph Holmes. This is the Religion Unplugged podcast, your one-stop shop for all the best religious news and culture. I'm Religion Unplugged's culture critic, and with me today is a filmmaker, Lotfy Nathan. He is a writer, director, cinematographer, and producer behind such films as The 12 O'Clock Boys and Harka. His latest film, The Carpenter's Son, about Jesus' childhood, and starring Nicolas Cage as Joseph, is in theaters now. Lotfy, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So your film is about the childhood of Jesus, something that the Bible and for most Christian tradition that Christians are familiar with doesn't really, talk very much about.
Yeah.
And so as the film's opening states, it's based on the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, which are a collection of fables around Jesus' childhood, which most scholars date around to 2nd or 3rd century after Jesus' death. But can you tell me what inspired you to want to make this film, and what inspired you to kind of go to those infancy gospels for inspiration?
Yeah. Well, I was introduced to the text by my father, who's big into religious history, and I was raised Coptic Christian, so I have like a familiarity with the Bible and the lessons, and had that upbringing. I didn't ever intend to make a story about the Holy Family, let alone this kind of, strange, missing piece of the puzzle story, this speculative piece of fiction. But when I learned about the apocryphal Gospels and the Infancy Gospel and looked at it, it just struck me immediately that this would be just a great novel entry point for a film. And I was surprised that I hadn't really seen that before. Um, there is a film, The Young Messiah, but I saw a different way to do it immediately, and I thought that it's a movie that I thought I'd like to see that. So that was really the thing that caught me, and then from then it was just a matter of reinterpreting that text. If it was a one-to-one adaptation of the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, it would be pretty salacious. I think that there's a reason that it didn't make the cut. And it's sort of like I almost looked at it as like fan fiction that was written around the time of the Gospels of the New Testament, which to me made it even more interesting. Especially in this field of movies today that we see. There's like, superhero origin stories and all of that. And I thought, well, why can't we have one like that for this story? I mean, that obviously is a whole can of worms, because that's precious terrain, and it's delicate. But in spirit, really, it's not quite as much based on the Infancy Gospel of Thomas as inspired by the idea of the book, which is the missing chapter. That's really what it's supposed to be. Sorry, that's a long spiel there, but cut me off at any point.
No, that's really interesting. I want to jump on a couple of those
Yeah, of
things
course,
that
of
you
course.
said, which is, yeah, I loved how you talked about that the Infancy Gospel of Thomas is, if you look at it in modern terms, it is kind of speculative fan fiction. It's like, okay, we have the canon, we
Yeah,
have what, for if you're religious, like these are what actually happened. And if you're not religious, like these are the ones that the fan community has been officially, is the official writings of this. And then you have
sure.
people who are like, well, what's stuff around this? How do I interact with this on my own terms in ways that I feel
Mhm.
like are missing in this? And that becomes, people obviously have very, and rightly have very strong opinions upon that when you add it, not just being something a corporation made up like Marvel, but is something that is very important to their faith. But
Of course.
it is a
It's
very,
central to their faith. Yeah.
but that is a really good way to describe it. It's like that's what you're doing, is you're having an imaginative back and forth with this, with your faith in an artistic way.
Yeah.
Now, one thing I want to get deeper into that in a moment. One thing I want to give for people who are not really aware of what a Coptic Christian is.
Mhm.
From people are familiar, a lot of our religions, particularly again, is like, Protestantism or Catholicism,
Of course.
particularly
Yeah.
in Western context.
Yeah.
But what's different about being a Coptic Christian, and how maybe does that influence kind of how you're interacting with some of these stories?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the Copts, like I think a large majority of Catholics as well, share in that they don't recognize that text as canonical. There's no like, the Orthodox, the Coptic Orthodox Christians are just that. They're Orthodox, and it's a very stringent sect of Christianity. It's a very old sect, and I think they have it's very traditional values with it as well. So all to say, there's members of my family who aren't thrilled about the idea of this, exploration. Uh, I'm trying to think what specifically, as someone of Coptic background, if that made any difference. I don't know that it did.
Right.
I just had you have Sunday school, you learn about
Sure.
all those questions, and as a child, I'm sure in any of the denominations, you wonder about the gaps in the story and all of that, and
Yeah.
you also try to picture things and imagine what they might have looked like.
So, what are some of those things that were compelling to you about those missing years? And what questions that it brought up to you that made you especially really interested in wrestling with in this kind of story?
Yeah. Well, there's a few layers to that. There's the novelty, first of all, of just, what happened in this timeline. Could Jesus and Satan have had an encounter prior to the temptation in the desert? It's possible if you are looking at the text, and there is no clear implication, even really, if if there was their first encounter or not. You know, so that stuff to me was really interesting. That was my an entry point. Additionally, I felt ultimately like an effort to find the human connection, the personal connection in this massive, incredibly important story,
Yeah.
through a kind of narrow scope, it being this kind of obscure time in Jesus's life, which happens to be a tight nuclear family at one point that was trying to survive, and had to also live day to day. And that to me was it was very interesting, compelling. And it was also for the actors, who wanted to treat it that way. So yeah, those layers I think were really the big pull.
Yeah, I have to say, again, as soon as I heard about this story, I was really excited by it, just because, again, I think faith-based horror is an untapped kind of market. I know that that's a reductive way to describe it, but welcome to Hollywood, I guess. But
Yeah.
but
Yeah. It's
because
funny
for a
that
norm,
we have to slap labels on it,
yeah.
This is the thing.
But for family is so important to Christians, and
Yeah.
you've got the Holy Family, and faith and stress questions of faith and doubt are so important and to Christians. And then also the idea that the world, if you're a Christian, it's a beautiful place because God made it and he's redeeming it, but it's also a scary place because there's demons, there's miracles, there's conflict. And that's something that I think is such a cool aspect of you telling the story about a family that's struggling with being in the midst of this cosmic drama, and
Yeah.
they're wrestling with the doubts and the weight of their decisions
Yeah.
about it. And so I think that there's a lot I think that's really exciting about this story from that perspective.
Yeah. Yeah,
um
I think so too. I mean, that kind of genre lean to me was just to further, you know, this whole thing was an exploration of the text and the story to try to see it in a new way, which has to do with the timeline and also the way that it's told, the aesthetic, you know. So I thought that's new too because it struck me simply that a lot of the Bible is frightening. I mean, it possesses the most horrific aspects of the imagination of people, which is hell, and
yeah.
the idea of the devil. So, and that's something that in art throughout the centuries with Christian art is a long-standing tradition of depicting that stuff as well,
Yeah.
So I think, I don't see I see how on the surface that can seem a bit provocative, but for me it was more just, I've described it this way many times now as this sort of a color palette that
Yep.
you choose more than anything. It's almost arbitrary. That said, it's interesting because I'm finding now, if with this critical reception that we've been getting, it's very polarized. I think that there's a group of people who, on the, say, the horror genre side, who are like, why isn't this more messed up? Why isn't this more devious and going all the way? And then on the faith side, I think it's a already also there's a lot of reticence about the effort of giving it that genre trope as well. So it's an interesting in between, but to me that was necessary because I didn't want to make an out and out horror film. It wasn't to just do a sort of wacky spectacle, gonzo spectacle in the midst of this world. It really was to also examine the characters,
Yeah.
as
I want
we
to, no, yeah, absolutely. I want to touch on that there because this is always the difficulty in terms of whenever you are taking on sort of any property, pre-existing property,
of course, yeah,
especially religious text. I mean, again, if you look at the trailer for the new Wuthering Heights film,
yeah,
and it's like, hey, we're doing this kind of much more erotica, sexy kind of version of the story, and we're saying,
yeah,
and we're the accusations of race swapping in that movie and stuff like that. People have very strong, passionate ideas about why this is the wrong way
yeah.
to adapt this
Yeah,
story.
don't mess with our story. We know it this way and don't touch it.
Right. And so there's definitely this conversation that happens anytime you're doing an adaptation. But the line is always about at what point, you have to have creativity because that's how you bring life to it. And that's how you're actually exploring something. And that's why it's worth telling again, so to
Yeah,
speak.
I
But
think you do.
you also have to have enough faithfulness to it that people say, well, you're interacting with the actual text that I'm familiar with, and therefore actually causing me to interact with that thing. So, for a lot of people who are like Christians, one of the things that's always been a sticking point in any sort of adaptation of the Gospels, particularly ones that have been trying to emphasize Jesus' humanity, like, you go to the Last Temptation of Christ, is one sticking point always seems to be that in emphasizing Jesus' humanity, you kind of end up making him sinful. You end up, and again, in Last Temptation of Christ, he just confesses the fact that he sins constantly.
Yeah,
And in the fact, and there are points like within your story, and certainly if you look at, you know, the Infancy Gospel of Thomas,
of course.
where Jesus has borderline things, and then certain things where crosses the line, where it's like, okay, like, yeah, this would be what Christians would call sin, and
Yes.
yet if you're a Christian, you look at the text of the Bible, it's like he was tempted as we were, but did not sin. And so there's stuff like, okay, well, at this point, you're not actually wrestling with the Jesus of the Bible that
Yeah.
I'm familiar with. So you're not forcing me to wrestle with my faith. You're forcing me to wrestle with a kind of obscure thing that's maybe, Lofty made up, that doesn't have anything to do with me. And so I say that just to say, for you as an artist and a filmmaker, how do you wrestle with that tension yourself in trying to interact with the text in a way that resonates with you, and without being restricted by what you're adapting, but
Yeah.
also allowing it to counterbalance you so you're actually interacting with it.
Yeah. Well, it's a very, very good point you make because from my perspective, if you're going to bother to tell this kind of story as a film, with conflict, which inevitably, movies are about conflict. There's always a conflict that is being overcome in a story, an internal and external conflict. It's kind of like the 101 of a
I think
story,
I've heard that. Yeah.
right? So, that's a decision that I made. I'm well aware, and that the Orthodox Christians believe the same thing, that Jesus was without any moral, psychological frailty or vulnerability. Like it was completely divine in every respect except his physical being, which was vulnerable to pain and suffering, right, and sacrifice as a result, right? As a symbol of that. Um, I would never try to prescribe, you know, people who believe that to think any differently. That's not my place. But it's also my right, and my interest to explore that, that because personally I believe that the idea that he could have possessed doubts and weakness as a human being make the story all the more potent, and actually the sacrifice and the symbol of Jesus's sacrifice on earth, even more, there's no higher stakes than that, right? I also, my read of the Bible it implies that there was that doubt. I think about that line, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" That's spoken on the cross, and in that I read someone who at that moment feels alienated or abandoned, and that's the way I read it. I think and that to me implies doubt and some degree of angst. It doesn't make somebody a bad person. It means that they're human, and I think that that's to me just a important way for us to be able to connect. You know, uh, Hopefully that's answering your question. I don't know if I just started dancing around it, but did that answer your
I
question?
don't think that you're at all attempting to dance around it. No,
Yeah.
I want to be sensitive to your time. Do we
Okay.
have more time to dive deeper into this, or is this where we should cut it off?
You have a couple more minutes. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, cool.
It's good.
So I want to. so I
Thanks,
want to.
Courtney. We're in the thick of it here, huh?
No, yeah, because our listeners and viewers would be very interested in this. I
Yeah.
guess for me, where do you draw the line? Because I think most Christians that I know would say there's a distinction between, let's say, doubts and sin. And there's places where it's like, and there's can be vulnerability because he says he was tempted in every way that we were and did not sin. Like you said, he was on the cross and those things. I think for a lot of Christians, what they look at is they say, I'm not seeing a Joseph who doubts here. I'm seeing a Joseph who might be abusive,
Oh, I
and
see.
and I'm not seeing a Jesus who doubts here is vulnerable to Satan's temptations. I'm seeing one who, and I'm gonna try to avoid spoilers here, but there's a certain moment where there's blasphemy blackmail that Jesus engages in, where
Yeah,
he's
and a recklessness. Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
and I think that that's going to be the part that for people it's like, okay, it crosses over from being having vulnerabilities
yeah.
to there's an active Christianese sinfulness here. And so it kind of like, why did you feel like that was a direction that was worthwhile going in order to interact with the text the way you wanted to?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, in the effort of making this coming of age story, that was a thing. I think that I guess the question is, was there anything for Jesus to learn in living on earth, or was there nothing that he needed to learn in living on earth? And what I'm speculating on is that there was something to that he was growing and evolving, you know, and that the guardianship of Joseph was part of that. I wouldn't call Joseph abusive in the story, but I think he's daunted, and I think he's got good intention, you know, and I tried to speculate what it might have been like for this all too human person to have to raise the Son of God, Um, so in that, I also wanted to see if there were some lessons that he could be taught. Again, it's like I think that sin. I guess I don't see sin as this completely damning thing. I think that there's redemption as well that can come after. I think it to me it just makes a person more relatable to feel that they're capable of that, but also of reaching divinity as well.
Awesome. Well, this has been a really cool conversation. I'm always, again, somebody who watches a lot of faith based content and a lot
Mhm.
of movies in general. I'm really excited when somebody is trying to do something new, whether or not I think it works or not, and in what ways, to what degrees. I'm really excited for you, also the audience, to know that something like this is out there, and this sounds like something that's really you'd be interested in and want to engage with. It's in theaters now and will be on, all the platforms, I assume, when all that happens.
Mhm.
So anything you'd like to leave people with before we check out?
No, that's all. I hope people check it out and make up their own minds with it, and try to enter with an open mind if they want to see it.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. This is
Thank you.
Lotfy Nathan, and this is Joseph Holmes with your Religion Unplugged podcast, your one-stop shop for all the best religious news and culture.